the early 90s, South African authorities, overrun by serial killers in the wake of apartheid's collapse, were faced with one particular serial competing to be more prolific than most in their radar. The victims of the killer, all female, they were lured to outlying fields where they were beaten, stripped, raped, and strangled with articles of their own clothing. Some were found with their hands tied behind their backs, others blindfolded. Many were left with pieces of clothing draped across their faces as if to prevent them from staring at the face of their killer as they die. The serial rapist and serial killer responsible for the ABC murders, so-called because they largely took place in Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and the Cleveland suburbs of Johannesburg, committed 38 murders, 40 rapes, and 6 robberies between 1994 and 1995 in Gauteng, South Africa. This is the profile of the ABC killer, the South African strangler, or the Gauteng killer. Hi, and welcome to the most foul true crime. 17 September 1995, Inspector Vivian Beeld called entomologist Dr. Mervyn Mansell with a request. A body was discovered in a field at the Van Dyke mine near Boksburg, South Africa. Dr. Mansell was to assist in determining the time of death. The request was familiar because Inspector Beeld had made a similar request 2 weeks earlier. This would be Dr. Mansell's first forensic case. He had no idea what to expect. En route to the crime scene, Dr. Mansell was shocked to find out that there was actually not just one body, but 5. By the time they arrived at the site, more bodies had been discovered. It was, in fact, a mass grave. By the next morning, police had found a total of 10 women in varying degrees of decomposition. This meant that the killer had returned repeatedly to the dump site to dispose of victims. Dr. Mansell consciously decided not to view the bodies as people, but simply as organic remains. This helped him concentrate on his work rather than being overwhelmed by the sheer horror of what he was seeing. When the bodies were examined, it turned into a remarkably interesting scientific scenario because there were bodies in all different stages of decomposition. This unstoppable domino of events started just the previous evening. A police reservist took his dog to hunt some rabbits in the field and discovered the first body. Less than 24 hours later, more than 30 members of the police were on the scene searching the surrounding area for evidence, including murder and robbery unit detectives, forensic experts, a helicopter, and the canine unit. The most tragic discovery at the scene, the body of a 2-year-old boy. He was found approximately 20 meters away from where Leta Ndlangamandla had been found. It was later learned that Sbusiso was Leta's son. She had left earlier in April to meet a man in Pretoria North about a job offer. Having no one to leave Sbusiso with, she took him along. The pathologist was unable to determine the boy's manner of death. Although there was an injury on his head, it was possible that Sbusiso died of exposure after walking around the field, staying near his mother's corpse because he did not know what else to do. The police, overwhelmed with the barrage of evidence, began to piece together a timeline that started months before the scene discovered at the Van Dyke mine. This is the timeline. On 13 May 1995, 29-year-old Esther Mushubudi Manecha's body was discovered in a cornfield near Hercules in Pretoria. Her lower body was nude. She had been strangled with clothing. She was last seen the previous evening as she left a cafe for home. The next body was found exactly 1 month later, although 5 women had gone missing in the interval. 13 June, Francina Nomsasiteve, aged 25, was found sitting against a tree. Although she was wearing a dress, closer examination revealed that her underwear and handbag strap had been tied around her neck and then around the tree. 3 days later, on 16 June, Elizabeth Granny Matetsa's nude body was discovered in Roslyn, an industrial area about 14 kilometers to the northwest of Pretoria. She was 19 years old and had last been seen alive on 25 May. 22 June, a body was found in Atteridgeville, raped and strangled. This woman's identity document was found nearby. She was 30-year-old Ernestina Mohadi Mosebo. 2 days later, on 24 June, Nikiwe Diko's body was found in Atteridgeville. She had been missing since 7 April. She went to meet someone about an employment opportunity. Her hands had been tied together with her underwear. Her pantyhose had been tied around her neck and wound so tightly with a stick that bone fragments were embedded in the material. A stick had also been used to mutilate her private parts. Police only managed to find her skull the following day, 40 meters away from her torso. Wild dogs had gotten to her. Her body lay in pieces strewn across the field. Her wedding ring was still on her finger and was identified by her husband. Absalom Sangweni lived in a caravan in Bayers Park, Boksburg. On 17 July, he witnessed a man and a woman walk into a field some distance from his home. Later, the man re-emerged alone. Absalom went into the field and found the woman assaulted and still. He went to a nearby supermarket and called the police. Sergeant Gideon O'Neill responded and found that Josephine Mansalim Langeni had been strangled with the belt of her dress. She was a 25-year-old mother of 4. She had gone to meet someone about a potential job offer. The next day, 18 July, Granny Dimakatso Ramela was found in Pretoria West, lying face down. She was clothed and the garrote used to strangle her was still around her neck. She was only 21 years old. She had disappeared on 23 May. Mildred Ndia Lipule, aged 28, was taken to Pretoria by her husband a week after Granny Ramela disappeared to meet a man about a job offer. He never saw his wife alive again. Her body was found on 26 July in a canal near the Bonaccord Dam near Onderstepoort. Her pantyhose had also been used to strangle her, and her underwear had been drawn over her face. On 8 August, another body was found at Onderstepoort. She was identified from the items found in her handbag as Elsie Koti Masango, age 25. She had been missing since 14 July. The next day, another body was discovered in the same area. This woman had been burned beyond recognition, most likely due to a veld fire. She has never been identified, and it is not known how long she had been there. 2 weeks later, on 23 August, 30-year-old Oscarina Vuyokazi Jakalasi's body was found near Boksburg. She had disappeared on the same day that Elsie Masango's body had been found on 8 August. On 28 and 30 August, 2 more bodies were found at the Bonaccord Dam. The second body seemed to have been there for some months. Neither one of them were ever identified. Due to the increased police presence at Onderstepoort, the killer returned to the Cleveland area. Then, yet another unidentified body was found on 12 September. 4 days later, the first body was discovered at the Van Dyke mine near Boksburg. 9 more would be found during the next 2 days. The victims who were discovered near the Van Dyke mine were Makoba Trifina Mukhodzi, 26 years old, disappeared on 15 August. Nelisiwe Nontobeko Zulu was also 26. She was last seen on 4 September on her way to search for a job. 43-year-old Amelia Dikamakatso Rapodile disappeared on 7 September after she left her place of employment, Johannesburg International Airport, now OR Tambo. She was in the company of a man who had promised her a better job. She was found with her hands tied behind her back and then to her neck with her pantyhose. Her bank card had been used to withdraw money 3 times later on the night of her disappearance in Germiston. Monica Gabisile Vilakazi left her grandmother's house on 12 September to look for work. She had left her 4-year-old son in the older woman's care. She was 31 years old. 21-year-old Hazel Nozipho Madikizela was found with her hands tied to her neck with her underwear. She was last seen by her parents in Germiston. Tsidi Malekwa Matela was identified more than 2 years later in November 1996. Originally from the neighboring Lesotho, she was 45 years old when she died. The other 4 women only received numbers, allocated by the mortuary as they were entered into the death register. Sadly, all that will ever be known of them is their manner of death. Besides Onderstepoort, the Van Dyke mine crime scene received an immense amount of attention due to the amount of evidence found and processed at the scene. The media was also present in full force. Commissioner George Fivers, head of the South African Police, surveyed the area from a helicopter. President Nelson Mandela was concerned enough about the crime wave to cancel a scheduled trip abroad, appearing in Boksburg with high-ranking justice officials, where he appealed for the public to aid in tracking the killer. He also met all the detectives and other forensic experts at the scene. All this activity probably ensured the killer to seek out a new dump site. There were 2 interesting aspects about the Van Dyke mine site itself. It was located almost 5 kilometers from Boksburg prison, a proximity that seemed more than a coincidence, although no one was sure what it meant. The other was the discovery of numerous items of ritualistic significance in the seemingly endless array of ant heaps scattered across the adjacent stretch of field. These items included black and red candles, mirrors, feathers, knives, lingerie, amongst other things. These items were believed to be related to African spirituality and traditional ritualistic practices. In addition, there was an alarming discovery at the scene. With the 4 latest victims found at the Van Dyke mine, the killer had combined his methods of binding and strangling. The most recent women had had their hands tied to their necks so that they would essentially strangle themselves the more they struggled. All this information seemed to point in different directions and different suspects. But what all authorities could agree on, the killer targeted unemployed black women in their 20s to early 30s who looked after their appearance. He offered them employment opportunities. He led them on foot to one of his killing sites in the Gauteng area, perhaps claiming it was a shortcut to his office. Then, in a secluded area, this is when the horror would start. He would bind their hands, undress them, rape them more than once, and strangle them with their own garments, mostly underwear, but sometimes belts, shoelaces, purse handles. The latest victim would be raped and murdered directly over an older body to amplify their terror. Afterwards, he covered their faces with their own clothing and weighed the clothes down with stones to conceal what he had done. On 17 July, the same day as Josephine Mansalimlangeni's murder, a special investigating team was established under Captain Vinolful Yoon of the Pretoria Murder and Robbery Unit. He had been investigating the last couple of murders in the series and collected all the dockets of victims with a similar modus operandi. Although Captain Frans van Niekerk of the East Rand Murder and Robbery Unit was the investigating officer at the scene in Boksburg, he had no qualms about contacting Captain Viljoen, and they decided to join forces and share information on the investigation. With a growing list of victims on one hand and the police failing to identify and capture the ABC killer, the authorities decided to call for reinforcements. Enter renowned international experts, criminal profilers, Dr. Mickey Pistorius and Mr. Robert Ressler. Dr. Pistorius had attended a conference in Scotland in June 1995 where she met Robert Ressler and Roy Hazelwood, both retired FBI profilers. She had previously consulted with Ressler telephonically during an earlier case in 1994, but in Scotland they became properly acquainted. In fact, they had discussed the earlier Cleveland and Atteridgeville murders. She contacted him and he immediately agreed to fly to South Africa. The ex-FBI profiler arrived on 23 September 1995. 2 days later, while a prayer service was being organized for that evening at the Boksburg site, they began visiting the crime scenes and studying dockets. Upon an initial glance of the crime scenes and dockets, they felt uncertain about the confusing array of differences. Some victims had been bound, but others had not. Of those who had been bound, some had had their hands tied in front and others behind them. It all seemed very haphazard, and they were unsure whether the same man had killed all the victims. In the meantime, detectives were busy setting up an operations room as Dr. Pistorius was affixing the crime scene photos to a board, arranging them in the order in which the victims had been killed. She saw a pattern. Earlier, they had been studying the dockets in the order in which the bodies had been found. Now that the victims had been identified and the sequence of murders was known, she could vividly see how the killer's strategy had evolved and improved over time. Clearly, he was refining his technique with each murder. Pistorius and Ressler concluded that the murders in all three communities were linked. In Dr. Pistorius's first book, Catch Me a Killer, she described it as one of the most horrific scenes I had ever seen. Decomposed bodies were strewn over the field, some only meters away from others. Maggots were feasting, and the stench penetrated our nostrils and clung to our clothing. In fact, all 10 bodies lay within a radius of about 300 yards. They seemed to be everywhere. It was possible to tell that the more recent victims had been killed at the scene. Dr. Pistorius did not find it hard to imagine the killer leading his victim into the field amongst the rotting bodies, paralyzing her with fear before he raped and killed her. As if to affirm the profiler's thoughts, one victim had a stain on her jeans where she had wet herself in terror. By the time Ressler arrived, Dr. Pistorius had already drawn up a profile and together with Ressler worked to refine it. The collaborative profile of the ABC killer was presented as a black male in his late 20s or early 30s, probably self-employed with access to money, drives an expensive car, and wears expensive albeit flashy clothes and jewelry. He frequents social establishments where alcohol is sold and enjoys socializing. The suspect has antecedents for fraud or theft and is highly intelligent and streetwise. He is likely socially competent, charming, and a ladies' man. It is possible that he is also married, separated, or divorced. He detests women despite being very charming to them. When he approaches a victim, It is done in a very calculating way, and he is very conscious that he is eventually going to kill the victim and savors the thought while he softens her up. He has a high sex drive and peruses pornography. His fantasies, to which he masturbates, are aggressive, and he believes that women are merely objects to be abused. May have been exposed to sexual violence in his past, perhaps as a juvenile. He collects mementos that he disposes of later and masturbates after the crimes. He might brag to others of the possibility of him being the killer, but using the third person, and taunts the police. He follows reports of the murders and the investigation in the press. Ressler's profile went on to suggest that the ABC killings were possibly the work of a team of 2 killers. As already stated, around the Van Dyke mine crime scene, authorities discovered numerous items of ritualistic significance in the seemingly endless array of ant heaps scattered across the adjacent stretch of field. These items included black and red candles, mirrors, feathers, knives, lingerie, and more. These were believed to be related to African spirituality or traditional ritualistic practices. Some investigators believe that the murders may have been related to such practices. Traditional healers or sangomas are prevalent in South Africa. According to Ingo Lamprecht, sangomas, male or female, play many different social and political roles in the community. They participate in divination, healing, directing rituals, protective medicine, and smelling out witches, as well as narrating the history, cosmology, and myths of his or her tradition. Umuti, in particular, is a problematic area since it can be prepared using anything from roots, animal pieces, human body parts, especially the eyes, organs, and genitalia. Which ingredients are used mostly depends on the conscience of the healer. There have been numerous accounts of muti murders, frequently involving babies or young children. These murders are often committed in the hopes of amassing great wealth. Although the possibility that the women at the Van Dyke mine may have been murdered by the same person or group responsible for the paraphernalia in the ant heaps, whether for muti or other reasons, was investigated. Dr. Pistorius saw the Atteridgeville killer's signature on every victim. The typical railway line was nearby as well. She was certain that he had walked where she was walking now. Another initial suspect for the ABC killings was a man called David Silepe. He became a viable suspect because he allegedly strangled 12 women in Johannesburg, South Africa, within a 4-month period. Unfortunately, none of the women could easily be identified. However, their clothes revealed they were smartly dressed. And as the police strive to identify the bodies, more shock awaited them. While this investigation was ongoing, the bodies at the Van Dyke mine were discovered between 16 and 18 September. This discovery brought the total to 8 women, all who were between the age of 23 and 30. With a number of investigations taking place at the same time, the police were faced with pressure to solve the mystery and became desperate to arrest the killer. Then they decided to hold a press conference and appealed to him to surrender. "We are on your trail. We will catch you. We know you need help and there are specialists who understand you and can help. Let us help you before things get worse," Colonel Dave Bruce, police spokesperson, pleaded. 2 months after, the National Commissioner of the Police did in fact ask Ressler to look into the case against David Silepe. Together with Dr. Pistorius, he pored over the dockets and the evidence and concluded that Silepe did appear to have been involved in the Cleveland killings. The profile drawn for the Atteridgeville, Boksburg and Cleveland killers was identical. and Ressler believed that Selepe was somehow involved in the Cleveland murders, either as an accomplice or as the only killer. Ressler's profile went on to suggest that the ABC killings were possibly the work of two team killers working together. However, his main argument for this was that Selepe had been filmed by the ATM camera while using one of the victim's cards. They launched a manhunt for him. However, Selepe remained elusive. Eager to capture him, they widened their search to neighboring Mozambique. On 15 December 1994, 31-year-old Selepe was arrested in Maputo. He was driving his Mercedes-Benz. After ransacking it, police found blood splattered in the trunk of the car and newspaper cuttings about the murders. He was extradited to South Africa. Selepe confessed to killing 15 women, 4 more than the figure police had. Selepe then agreed to take police to the areas where he had dumped the bodies. Accompanied by 3 police officers, Selepe pointed out an area in the field and said he had hidden multiple victims' clothes there. But while an officer bent down to confirm the claim, Selepe struck him with a tree branch, sending him sprawling on the ground. Selepe then started running. An officer responded by gunning him down. That effectively sealed his fate. An inquest later ruled that the officer could not be held responsible for his murder. His death, however, did not end the murders. The killings did continue. Commissioner Fivers told the press that there was no connection between the Van Dyke mine site and the Cleveland murders because Selepe had been killed. He did, however, admit that it was possible that the killings may have been linked to those in Atteridgeville. He also revealed that a reward of $200,000 would be available to anyone who had information that may lead to the arrest of the killer. Selepe was initially attributed to 6 of the murders, but controversy did at the time and now surrounds his true involvement in the killings. 4 of the aforementioned 6 murders were later attributed to the ABC killer, but outside of Amanda Tete, it was never revealed which of the murders Selepe was exonerated for, and what evidence was used to attribute the 6 murders to either the ABC killer or Selepe. The ABC killer's profile bore a striking resemblance to the one on the Cleveland series. Ordinarily, this is not of much concern because a profile describes a type of person rather than a particular one. And although every killer is different, some do share many characteristics. Still, in this case, it was somewhat disconcerting. With the crime scenes overlapping, the modus operandi being so familiar, the times so close together, and most problematic of all, David Selepe being killed before he could be tried for the Cleveland murders. Finally, the authorities realized that the man who had been filmed by the ATM camera was in fact not Selepe. The man in the tape was later identified as to be the last known suspect of the ABC murders, Moses Sithole. Moses Sithole was born in Vosloorus, a black residential area just south of Boksburg in 1964. When he was a child, his father died. Later in his childhood, his mother abandoned him and his 4 siblings in a police station. Beforehand, she had instructed them to never tell the officers she was their mother. They were interned in an orphanage of Benoni and later transferred to KwaZulu-Natal. Claiming mistreatment, Sithole ran away after 3 years and went to live with his older brother Patrick. After an unspecified time, Patrick moved to Venda and Sithole sold their house without permission. Afterward, Sithole had a number of menial jobs in farms and gold mines surrounding Johannesburg. He liked to help street children and returned many runaways to their parents. Sithole was sexually precocious from an early age, but relationships were short-lived. It has been surmised that his mother's abandonment of her children might have played a role in his aggressive attitudes towards women. He is also reported to have told some of the rape victims of his own bad experiences at the hands of a previous girlfriend. Starting in 1987, Sithole began raping women. The following year, in the midst of his crimes, Sithole began a relationship with a 17-year-old girl in Boksburg, Sibongile Nkosi, whom he also mistreated. In February 1989, he raped Buyiswa Swakamisa and threatened her with a machete. Months after, Swakamisa saw Sithole standing outside her new workplace and called the police. In a very unprofessional move, officers forced Sithole and Swakamisa to share the back seat of a police car as they drove them over to the station. During this trip, Sithole hurled insults and profanities at Swakamisa, adding that he should have killed her. Sithole was later sentenced to 6 years in prison for his crimes against her. While still incarcerated, he met a woman named Martha who was visiting a relative in prison, and they began writing letters to each other. Eventually, Sithole was released in 1993 for good behavior, and he moved to Pretoria with Martha and her parents. In July 1994, while Martha was 5 months pregnant with Sithole's daughter, Sithole lured 18-year-old Maria Monama to Cleveland. His bait, like in all subsequent murders, was a desk job in a foundation named Youth Against Human Abuse, which did not actually exist. After raping and strangling Monama with his own hands, Sithole wrote 3 messages on her skin. "She is a bitch. I am no fighting with you. Please. And we must stay here for as long as you don't understand." It is believed that these messages were directed to law enforcement, and that for each time he killed, Sithole imagined he was taking his revenge on Swakamisa for reporting him. By autumn, 4 women had been found strangled in Cleveland, a 5th in Pretoria, and a 6th in Boksburg. One of them was Sithole's mistress, Amanda Tete, whose funeral was attended by Sithole. However, the police arrested a different man for that crime, David Selepe. Sithole's daughter was born on 5 December 1994. Later, months after the birth of their child, Sithole and Martha separated, and thus commenced Sithole's bloody rampage across the Gauteng province. Sithole became homeless and slept in train stations. From then on, more women were found murdered at an increasing pace in Pretoria, mostly in the Atteridgeville area and Boksburg, always not far from a railway. The police stated that they believed Selepe was the Cleveland killer, but that they could not rule out a connection to the new murders. The press dubbed the spree the ABC murders after the initials of Atteridgeville, Boksburg and Cleveland, and wondered if they were committed by the same killer, rendering Selepe innocent. Whilst the profiling was underway, investigations at the site revealed that one of the victims found, Amelia Rapodile, had last been seen before an appointment to see a man named Moses Sithole on 7 September. A job application form was found in which she was offered a position, and when a second victim showed a similar connection to Sithole, police were confident that they had unearthed a likely suspect. They were unable to locate Sithole, however, who continued with his killing spree. Sithole was unfazed by the manhunt and media attention, so much so the body of Agnes Mbuli was discovered near Benoni on October 3, 1995. On the same day, Sithole called the Gauteng newspaper The Star, saying that his name was Joseph Makwena and that he was the man that is so highly wanted. As described by the caller, he had been arrested in 1978 for a crime I didn't do, specifically a rape, and spent the next 14 years in prison where he was abused and tortured by fellow inmates. To make matters worse, the caller said his parents and sister had died while he was in prison. In retaliation for those wrongs, he explained, "I force a woman to go where I want, and when I go there, I tell them, 'Do you know what? I was hurt, so I am doing it now.' Then I kill them." He claimed responsibility for almost all the murders, but denied any part of the ones committed in Cleveland. He also insisted that he was not responsible for the deaths of 2-year-old Sibusiso Ndlangamandla and his mother, and claimed that he loved children. When asked how many victims he had killed, the caller claimed 76, twice as many as police had found thus far. To verify his claim, he signed off with directions to the corpse of "a lady I don't think the police have discovered." The game was set, the rules agreed upon. The match began. Sithole called his brother-in-law and told him that he needed a gun to protect himself. They agreed to meet at a factory where the brother-in-law worked in Benoni, and afterwards, the man immediately informed the police. The police planted an undercover officer, Francis Molovedzi, who posed as a new security guard. When Sithole arrived, he asked for his brother-in-law. The other security guards, who were unaware of the operation, told Molovedzi to get him. Molovedzi refused to leave his post because he did not want to lose sight of Sithole. Suspicious, Sithole fled and Molovedzi chased him into an alleyway. Molovedzi identified himself as a police officer and fired 2 warning shots, but Sithole attacked him with an axe, wounding his hand. In return, Molovedzi shot him in the leg and stomach. Sithole was then arrested and rushed to a hospital, where he was in critical condition for 2 days. He survived his wounds and was soon transferred from intensive care to a military hospital, where physicians diagnosed him with HIV. After his recovery, he refused to make a statement until a female officer visited him. Sithole then claimed to have committed over 10 murders and described several in detail while he masturbated. In custody, he boasted of teaching his victims a very good lesson by killing them. As the charges were mounting, the police had to finally decide whether Sithole was the accomplice of David Selepe, linked to a half-dozen murders of women in Cleveland. But Sithole denied ever meeting Selepe, and no evidence has been found to connect the 2 men. Furthermore, Selepe was killed while leading the police to the place where Amanda Tete was found. Tete's murder was attributed to Sithole after it was discovered that she was in a relationship with him at the time of her death. Sithole's DNA was found on Tete's body, but it could have been left as a result of consensual sex prior to her murder. Selepe was eventually exonerated of this particular murder. It is not known if Selepe confessed to the murder to bolster his rampage and legend, or to grant his partner in crime a reprieve so he can escape and continue his spree undisturbed by the pursuit of police. Sithole also said there had been copycats styling their crimes after his own. Selepe, in contrast, said that he had 2 accomplices named Tito and Mandla, a fact that was not immediately released to the public. Adding to the confusion, Sithole used the alias Mandla when he made a taunting call to the grandmother of one of his victims once he was already in police custody. Likewise, someone who claimed to be named Martin, a recurring alias of Sithole's, called the workplace of one of the victims attributed to Selepe to inform the workers that she would not go to work that day because she had suffered an accident. According to Dr. Pistorius, even if Sithole was indeed allied with Selepe, Sithole will never admit it because he enjoys his celebrity status and does not want to share it. 5 days later, on 23 October 1995, With mounting evidence, the total charges against Sithole increased to 38 counts of murder, 40 counts of rape, and 6 counts of robbery. He pleaded not guilty to all charges at the magistrate's court in Brakpan. While in remand, Sithole agreed to and recorded a jailhouse confession videotape, which was made by Charles Kuman on the condition that Sithole and 3 other prisoners would get their share of the royalties. The video shows a visibly relaxed Sithole in a cell, either smoking or chewing on an apple, while giving a chilling account on one of his victims' last moments before death. Sithole, an avid talker, was a willing participant to a series of video and audio tapes made by fellow prisoners. In them, he told fellow prisoners that he hated women and felt he was teaching them a very good lesson by murdering them. This time, Sithole admitted to 29 murders and said that he did not know where the other 9 came from. According to Sithole, he got his main thrill from watching his victims' eyes bulge out as they die. On 3 November 1995, he was transported to Boksburg prison, where he had served his rape sentence 2 years previously to await his trial. During this time, press reports revealed Sithole's HIV-positive status to the public. Sithole's trial, scheduled to begin 14 November, was postponed when Sithole arrived in court that morning, his pants drenched in blood. He was rushed to a hospital, treated for an open knee wound apparently sustained at Pretoria Central Prison. When his trial finally convened in February 1997, an American voice expert identified Sithole as the caller who had boasted of his murders to reporters at the Star newspaper. Sithole had also confessed his crimes in detail to other inmates, some of whom were curiously equipped with both tape recorders and video cameras, capturing his boasts for posterity. The long-winded proceedings were delayed once again in August when Sithole started vomiting blood from a stomach ulcer, but there was no escaping justice. After journalist Tamsin de Beer of the Star newspaper was subpoenaed, she testified at the Pretoria High Court, where her evidence was key in the conviction of Sithole. One of the few witnesses to Sithole's crimes, Absalom Sangweni, also testified for the prosecution. On 17 July 1995, he watched a man and a woman walk into a field some distance from his home in Bayers Park, Boksburg. He called out to them since he knew that there was a fence around this patch of field and they could not continue far. But the man responded that he knew the area. After a while, they disappeared from view. Absalom, however, kept on watching. Some time later, the man re-emerged alone. Absalom thought he saw something bright in the man's hand, and he was looking around furtively as if he had been caught doing something wrong and wanted to get away fast. The man then ran off. Absalom went into the field and found the woman assaulted and still. He went to a nearby supermarket and called the police. Sergeant Gideon O'Neill responded. He climbed through the fence and found the woman. She was still warm, but Sergeant O'Neill could not find a pulse. His partner arrived with a first aid kit, but they were unable to resuscitate her. She had been strangled with the belt of her dress. Of the killer, however, there was no sign. Absalom regretfully admitted that he had been too far away and was unable to provide a proper description of the man he had seen. Building a chronological picture of his crimes, the prosecution introduced harrowing testimony from his earliest rape victims, detailing their ordeals at the hands of Sithole before his first conviction for rape. Then followed a detailed examination of his connection with each of the murdered victims, with testimony about the alleged job offers and the specific techniques used to lure his victims to their deaths. Sithole appeared cool and collected throughout. On 3 December 1996, The prosecution introduced a video that had been shot during Sithole's initial incarceration, in which Sithole candidly admitted to 29 murders. He described his technique in some detail, although he claimed he began killing only in July 1995, selecting his victims for their resemblance to the rape victim Buyiswa Doris Swakamisa, whom he regarded as responsible for his first jail sentence. The legality of the admissibility of this tape, recorded illegally in a jail cell, caused the trial to be delayed until 29 January 1997, and the technical issues relating to it, as well as Sithole's original confession, caused the trial to drag on until July 29, 1997, when the judge finally ruled that the evidence was admissible. The prosecution rested its case on 15 August 1997. The defense case depended largely on Sithole's denial of any involvement in the killings. When he took the witness box in his own defense, his testimony was often rambling and incoherent. However, one thing was constant. Sithole declared himself innocent of all charges and accused the police of forcing him to confess. 5 December 1997, more than a year after the case had commenced, Moses Sithole was found guilty on all charges. Justice David Curlis made a statement that in view of the abhorrent nature of the crimes, he would have had no hesitation in pronouncing a death sentence on Sithole. However, since the death penalty in South Africa had been declared unconstitutional in 1995, Sithole was sentenced to 50 years imprisonment for each of the 38 murders, 12 years imprisonment for each of the 40 rapes, and 5 years imprisonment for each of the 6 robberies. Since his sentences run consecutively, his total effective sentence is 2,410 years, with no possibility of parole for at least 930 years. The sentence is meant to keep Sithole behind bars for the rest of his life. Despite having the highest known body count of any South African serial killer, Sithole is not the most prolific because his crimes only spanned 2 years. The most prolific serial killer in South Africa is actually Bulelani Mabai, who murdered 11 women and 9 children, not unlike Sithole, within a 5-year span. Victims' families blame the deaths on the police. A family member once claimed they had gone to a police station to report that their sister was missing, only for an officer to offer little assistance and informing them that they did not have any stationery in the police station. Ironically, at the time, the medical treatment for Sithole's HIV condition in prison far exceeded any treatment available to the average South African citizen, which secured his life far longer, albeit in prison. Sithole was incarcerated in CMAX, the maximum security section of Pretoria Central Prison. He is currently incarcerated in Mangaung Correctional Center in Bloemfontein. The most concerning part of this case was the connection between David Selepe and Moses Sithole. On one hand, there are numerous coincidences and points of overlap between the two stories, while on the other, information and evidence thought to be related to Selepe later turned out to belong to Sithole instead. The murder of Amanda Tete is the perfect example to illustrate this. Although it was later proved that Tete was in a relationship with Sithole, when the body was examined, Sithole's DNA was found on it. If Selepe had nothing to do with her murder, why would he confess and supposedly lead the police to where her remains were disposed of? I believe Absalom Sangweni, one of the only witnesses to the crimes, did not get a good look at the killer. If he had, his testimony would have been key in determining if it was Selepe or Sithole. who was indeed the ABC killer. This is the profile of the ABC killer.